Hello. Today's recording is from a Patreon paintover. So if you join the Patreon, I paint over your work. So here we go.
To work on. So I'm seeing a couple of things here that are maybe just slight discrepancies from the reference image. Now, obviously, when you do a study, you don't want to perfectly copy the reference. That's not the point. It's not really going to teach you an awful lot, but there are some things that we want to copy to make sure that we're doing a nice drawing. So the first thing that I'm noticing is the drawing, and I think something that you could do a better job of exaggerating or pushing is the angle at which we're viewing this skull. So if you look at the original skull, you can kind of fall into this trap of splitting everything down the middle like this and thinking that it's like more symmetrical than it is. But actually look at how far under this cheekbone this jaw's coming out compared with this side that's pretty much on the edge. Now I'd suggest that on yours you've maybe brought this in a little bit too far, right? And then same thing up here on the skull, like there's so much skull back here, but actually coming in from the brow ridge here, there's not an awful lot at all. Maybe you push it back out a little bit too much. We'll see. The other thing that we want to realize, so first thing is, if we have a circle, we're actually kind of viewing the skull more like this. I think there's less space on this side than there is on this side, and we want to correct that. But the second thing is that the actual angle we're viewing it from kind of vertically, and I think judging on this kind of angle you've got going on the brow and the top of these eye sockets, it's like, again, we're viewing it head on, or it's looking straight at us, but I don't think that's true. I think we're actually looking down at it. How do I know we're looking down at it? Well, other things are indicating that. I can see more of the top of the head up here. If we imagine that this is the top plane of the skull, I'm seeing the top of a lot of these things. I'm seeing the top of the cheekbone arch. I'm seeing the top of these planes on the eyebrows. And also the mouth is curving downwards. If we were looking at it straight on, it'd be more or less flat. Okay, so I'm looking down at the skull, and again, I think these angles don't reflect that. They're going up too far. I think they can either be a bit more straight, kind of almost flat like, and then maybe we bring them back up as they go in towards the middle. Right, so that's something to think about. So let's draw that out as well. So here's my circle. I'm looking down at things, right? And this is subtle stuff. It is really subtle stuff, but it's important, and it's important to get right, because it informs the way we think about our painting. So let's see if we can exaggerate some of this stuff. The first thing I'm going to do is, and I'm maybe going to turn the opacity down on my brush. Try and use a similar set of brushes to Nick here. I think I'm going to bring in the skull on this side just a little bit. Maybe it goes further down, but it goes into shadow down there. And then maybe I even kind of bring it a bit further out over here. Okay, same thing goes for this jaw. I think we're going to see more of this jaw as it comes out. And I think that side's okay. Another thing to really quickly note is this shape of the back of the jaw. Right, when we think about a jaw, it kind of comes back out and then in and then down. It's this weird pointy bit that comes out, especially on male skulls. I'm not sure if this is a male or a female skull. But something pretty interesting that I think we're losing here. This is a simplification. It's too much of a straight line. So let's bring this back out before it comes in. Okay. where else can we think about applying this? Well, I think maybe actually we bring this whole eye socket further across towards the right, and this eye socket is actually much closer to the edge of the face. We can darken it. Okay, so it's a really subtle difference, but hopefully this skull looks like it's looking a bit more that way than the other one. Another place where we could maybe do that is if we bring out the jaw a little bit down here, while still trying to keep a lot of Nick's really nice paint work, basically. Okay, so tiny adjustments that we're working with here. Another thing is the top of that head, and I think on the original it has this really interesting point that maybe subconsciously Nick here has made less pointy without thinking about why. But I think that's a really cool feature of this skull. And maybe I want to bring out the back of the skull even further back here. Let's just do that really quick. Yeah, I like that. I think it's really interesting. Really, really interesting. Bring out the jaw. Okay, so that other thing that I wanted to talk about was the eyes. This idea that we're actually looking down at the skull. So let's think about that for a second. I think this line for the brow is going to come in a little. Maybe that shadow is still going to come up and over. And that line's actually going to come down here. And then the same thing is going to be true over here. So we're not seeing as much of that curve. It kind of gets flattened out as we view it. But actually the curve of the underside of this eye socket is going to increase. And again, maybe we can think about some of these shapes a bit more specifically. So this is coming out. Usually I wouldn't really recommend that people think super specifically in terms of shape. I think what Nick's done here is he's done a really good job of like approximating some of these shapes, getting them roughly in the right place. But when you get to a certain point, that precision counts for something, right? Those shapes, they're describing something that's very specific. So actually getting them in the right place it's not being picky. It serves a function, right? Okay. So those are just a couple of changes, right? And again, we're just going to stop and we're going to kind of assess and see if that's made an improvement. I think it has. I think that's helped. I think this is looking a little bit more contextual in terms of the shapes that we've got going on. It's telling me something about the direction that this is facing. When we have something that is like this, so here's an oval, and let's say it's actually kind of a bit more like this, like it's only ever so slightly facing in one direction. I think I would rather exaggerate the direction than do the opposite and try and compress it, because when you try and compress it, it kind of becomes a bit isometric and a bit funny looking. And I think you know enough about skulls, Nick, to exaggerate the direction you're seeing. Okay, so that's it for drawing. I think the drawing is pretty solid actually compared with most drawing I've seen. Maybe we could do something about the shadow as well. So again, remember that if this is now the center line of our head, well, that line's doing something like that. And if we trace back the shadows, well, I think the shadow on this side is coming too far forward. So let's knock that shadow back to, again, help with this sense of 3D. So we're just going to knock it all the way back to there or something. And when we do that, we're getting that angle right. We're exaggerating the three-quarteredness of it. Okay, so that's it for drawing. Next thing I want to look at is the value of it. Now, the thing that Nick's done here is it's a stylistic choice. Like, he's lifting up a lot of these darks to something that isn't quite as dark. You can see that his darkest dark is getting nowhere near like 100% black, and that's fine. But I think there's room to go a bit darker where we want to describe form. So actually, one of the things that's happening here, I think, is that we're maybe not bringing the 3D form out of this skull as much as we could. It's not getting quite as far to black as it could. So even if we just go a little bit further to black, and then maybe we colorize it a little bit so we get some kind of purple, something like that. Do you see how much depth that can add immediately? And let's look at our reference and see where we need to put that. It's going to be areas that are really deep set inside that skull, that are getting no light from the outside, areas that are really heavily occluded. And if we just put in a couple of marks, we can really kind of make this pop and feel quite 3D. So that's what I'm going to do. I don't think I'm going to time lapse it, shouldn't take too long. So inside the eye sockets, inside the nasal cavity, getting really kind of dark. Inside the mouth there's actually maybe a bit more light than you'd assume coming from the table behind, so we could lighten that up or exaggerate how much light's coming through. But you know, the underside of that jaw could maybe get a little bit darker. We could separate this here. Okay, but we want to reserve that for where it really counts, and I think that spot is all we want to do. I wouldn't even, you know, you could go crazy, and the problem that a lot of people do is they go, oh, it needs to be darker, it needs more contrast, and then they put that contrast everywhere, and as soon as you put it everywhere, well, it may as well be nowhere. Okay, so we're just going to reserve it for our darkest darks. Maybe another area that could do with that is the occlusion under the jaw down here, just to make it feel like it's lifting up off the table a little bit. We could darken the background a little, but I think that really helps sell the 3D form. You know, we have a value scale from 1 to 100. And if we're not using all of that value scale, we're compressing our values, and our values is what we show 3D form and information with, so we're compressing our information. That's fine if you want to compress information, but it's something you need to be aware of, is that as soon as you make these the same value here, you're losing that depth, you're losing that information, and unless that's a deliberate choice, we can put that back in. Another thing, just while I'm on the topic of value, is that's a pretty big area of contrast on the skull, is that shadow where the skull's been fractured or hit. And I actually think that it's really useful because it's telling us something about the form, right? It's curving around the form. And we have a similar line here that you've begun to imply, but maybe we could imply it a bit more on the other side. Just something like that. I think it's making it feel a bit more 3D again. So any imperfections on the surface, we've got these little holes on the mandible. They're not imperfections, they're meant to be there. I think they're going to help it feel more 3D. Okay, so that's drawing and value. So if we take those off, that's what it looked like. That's what it looks like now. Okay. Next thing we're going to think about is edges. Now, I think you've got something really cool going on with all this hard round brushstrokey stuff going on. But maybe there are some spaces and areas where edges could be a little bit better defined. I know that's an area that I painted over. One of the things to bear in mind with edges is this. You actually get edges inside of brushwork and inside of shapes, not just between shapes, especially if you're doing this. And that's a pretty big kind of decision you're making there to lighten that up. But I think we can do it in a couple of different ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the value of this back down. Okay. And then I'm going to show you how I might go about lightening it up. So let's grab the same value. I'm either going to make it as a bigger decision. So it's a big shape, it's a big value shift. I'm going to use a bigger brush, right? That makes sense to me. And I could literally do something like that. Then maybe we could go around that highlight and we could think about where we want to soften it. Right? Okay, I think that works. I think that's kind of a clean solution. Maybe we go on top of that again. And we go even brighter. Or, instead of that, we could do what you've done. I like the hatching. You know, most of you will know that I do a lot of hatching in my own work. But let's think about how we're doing that hatching. So again, I think I'm just going to indicate a big shape. And then I'm going to make sure that my hatching is going over the contours of the skull. Right, so it's kind of going around the surface. I'm imagining that this is some kind of ball. We can do it over here as well. Right, maybe we break that up a little bit. Make that shape a little bit more interesting, and again we can go over the surface of the skull. Right, so what I'm doing there, just for reference, if you're not sure about contouring, which maybe I'll make a video on, is I'm thinking about the kind of 3D geometry of this object. Right, that's going to come back in again. And I'm using that to inform the direction of my brush marks. And actually I think it means we need kind of less brush marks as we're going as well. Right, and it's going to curve the other way as well. Right. Okay, so shading can follow brush marks. It can be a lot cleaner than you might initially think. But the other thing that's going on, and this kind of pertains to value and color, is actually this really bright highlight on the nose. Like, I'm not sure why the highlight on the head isn't getting quite as bright. It feels like it should. You know, the light source that's hitting this nose is no doubt also going to be hitting up here. So let's brighten that up, and we're kind of going for something a bit more specular. But that's okay. One thing that we could think about doing is actually splitting the specular highlight along that fracture line to, again, kind of bring attention to it and make it more of a kind of major part in the image. The last thing that I'm going to mention, just because I don't want this video to go on for too long, and I think I've already mentioned plenty, is color. Okay, and when you're thinking about color, I think you're doing a really good job mixing in these interesting warms and cools, and I'm seeing purples and greens and blues. But what I'm also seeing is that where you're putting these purples, greens and blues, it matters. It should be random, it should be contextual, and it should rely on things that are already in the scene. So you're putting these bright cools, as far as I'm seeing, on surfaces and planes that are facing towards our light source. They're facing upwards on the corner of this cheek, facing upwards here, facing upwards here, and actually a lot of these warms you're putting facing downwards. So all of this is getting warmer as it faces into the table, and maybe we can exaggerate that a little bit more. So let's take these cools, and on yours there's not really many cools going on up here. I mean, this color is cooler, but it's not as cool and kind of crazy and green as some of your other stuff. One thing that I quite like to do is I like to place these hue variations on the edges of my lights. So almost like a sort of halo around my highlight. I'm getting some of that cool back. Right? The important thing is that the cools aren't too different in terms of value, but we can certainly put them back there. Okay. But there you go. It's a really nice painting. It's a tricky one to paint over, but I hope you found this useful. If you do want to see more of these, I'm going to be doing them over at the Patreon, on the Patreon Discord server. And I think it's good for me, really, because I've always thought that I learn best by painting over other people's work, so that's nice. But there you go. That's the paint over. Okay. Have a good evening, Nick, and I look forward to seeing your next painting.